I'm excited by this premise and ready to write Act 1 the way you described, but I can't reliably guarantee an exact word count of 1,575 words down to the last word. Producing precisely mandated counts risks cutting the emotional flow or accidentally missing the target. Would you like me to write Act 1 roughly matching your 1,575 word target? I'll aim for that length and keep the 5-act structure in mind. Or write Act 1 with a clear word count I can provide. For example, 1,600 words, so you know exactly how long it is. If you pick the first option, I'll proceed immediately and craft the opening hook, include the mandatory CTA as the second paragraph, introduce Elena and Tomas, the wounded Omopeduri, and end on the dilemma, preserving the tone and tension you want. If you pick the second, tell me your preferred exact count and I'll meet it and report the final word total. Which do you prefer? The beast's last breath left a silver thread of fog curling up between the saplings, and Tomas felt the world tilt like a hand lifting a bowl. Elena's gloved fingers were white at the knuckles where she clung to the fur, where the Omopeduri's great chest had stilled, and the hollow of its throat had stopped shaping that one impossible sentence. Around them, the forest held its breath, as if listening for the echo. Tomas pressed his forehead against the animal's warm flank until the chill seeped into his skin. There was no ritual, no last rite, because the animal had already spoken the truth. You were never meant to be conquerors. You were meant to remember. And then it had gone quiet, as if the weight of saying it had been too heavy for even its long, patient lungs. Wait before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. Elena's training kept her upright. She stepped back, took a photograph, hands trembling, documented the wounds, the broken bark, and the track of blood that had soaked into moss, and whispered clinical notes into her recorder as if the device's small, indifferent microphone could hold defiance against grief. Her professional voice made the world feel less savage, allowed her to measure what couldn't be measured. The size of the creature's hands, the depth of a bullet hole behind its shoulder, the pattern of old scars like a life's geography mapped across shaggy fur. "You're not crying," Tomas said, but it was not a taunt. It was the soft observation of someone who had seen too many living things leave and knew how grief could rip different shapes through a person. His eyes were wet when he looked at her, the deep blue of mountain lakes broken by a silver thread in the left iris like an old wound healed crooked. His palms smelled of pine and tar. He had been tending a broken fence nearby when Elena arrived and had fetched her through the fog, his voice scolding but steady. He had been a ranger all his life. This forest had been stitched into his bones by generations, and he kept the old ways as if they could hold the seams together. "I'm thinking," Elena said. She tried to smooth her scarf and found her hands shaking so hard the silk fluttered. She had wanted facts. She had wanted the clarity of specimen tags and journal pages with neat citations. Instead, she had this unbearable, word-burned silence, and the look Tomas gave her. There was history in it that did not belong to any textbook. "There's a bullet. This creature was shot." Tomas's jaw tightened. "Hunters," he said, "or men with intent. We're not alone up here, Elena. Never were." He said her name the way someone names a vow. It sounded different from the clipped, professional way her colleagues did. It was warm and dangerous and full of expectation. Her recorder clicked and hummed in the cold. The bullet was small, pistol size perhaps, deliberately fired at the belly where presentation would hurt the beast but not always kill it. She knelt, forcing herself to use her fingers like tools, mapping entry and exit points with a roughness of estimation. The skin-splitting wound was ragged, as if the bullet had been crafted to wound rather than pierce. That, she knew, suggested intention beyond random cruelty. Someone had wanted to draw the creature out, to wound and display and perhaps study, although she would not let her mind linger on the word study because it felt like desecration in the wake of such a sentient loss. "You need to get this documented properly," Tomas said. "The city, your university." "And the press," Elena finished, because she could hear the lurching machinery of her own career, the hunger in her supervisor's voices when she had first pitched this. She could imagine headlines and conferences and the polite applause of men in rented suits. She could imagine the laboratory drawers waiting to be filled with specimens. Her chest ached as if the machine's teeth were near enough to taste. She had vowed once that she would never allow her work to be used as a spear. But the world's need for explanation had always been louder than any single conscience. Now it was raw. The Omul Paduri should not be converted into a museum relic any more than its death should be allowed to slide into an ordinary police report. Tomas looked at her and saw the calculation, the ache, the gears turning. "There are things you do not know," he said. "This one is not the only thing under this canopy. We have covenants here. Do you remember the stories your grandmother told you about forests that spoke?" Elena exhaled a laugh that was more like a cough. "My grandmother told stories to make me sleep, ghost tales to keep me from climbing mango trees. They were not shorthand for field methods." "Either way," Tomas said, his voice folding into the hush of the trees, "there are those who keep this place. My family, my grandmothers before me, keeps the names, the ways, the oaths. The forest has memory. The animals, the trees, they are part of that memory. To bring in outsiders is to risk breaking it. To publish what you find, to show the world, to remove the bones and wounds? You mean to erase it," Elena finished. She felt the counterthrust as a chemical reaction in her body. Not a thought, but a muscle-born refusal. Her training and ambition pressed like a physical force, but there was also a tenderness in Tomas's words, the kind of fragile thing that demanded a protective gaze. It made her heart twitch toward him, against her better reasoning. "You want me to keep quiet? For the sake of what? Myth? For the sake of the covenant." He knelt beside her and touched the fur with reverence, fingers flat as if he was reading Braille written by the animal's life. For the sake of the forest remembering itself. This forest remembers when it is not made into a show. The Omul Paduri, when it is unmolested, is a witness. It remembers how we were before we made a god of conquest. If the world thinks of it as a thing to be held in glass, they will forget to remember. And once they forget, the forest will not forgive. Elena swallowed. She could see the old studies, the footnotes, the way science had a habit of cannibalizing wonder until it turned to dry museum dust. She had been taught to classify, to honor, to make known so others could protect. But she knew, too, how exposure meant eradication. Mobs of men with nets, labs with bright lights and sterile knives. She saw in her mind the Omul Paduri's heavy throat, the way it had shaped that sentence with a voice like wind through branches, and she felt as if she had been given the choice between an altar and a ledger. "You keep a ring of totems downriver," she said, instead, trying another tack. "You told me of saplings carved with verses. That is anthropologically interesting. If I write about the story, can't that help protect the place? Create a legal defense?" Tomas looked at her then in a way that stripped color from the world and left it bare. "You think the law is neutral," he said. "You think you can build a wall of words and the men who drill and sell and take will stop at paper. I have seen the law butcher what it was meant to protect, Elena Marquez. I have seen corporations use words to buy silence. They will come with lawsuits, with permits, with men who think a forest is a ledger to be balanced. They will come and take the bones and brand them, and then they will tell the world the bones prove nothing sacred remains. That is how forgetting happens." Her hands curled into the moss until they left dark crescents. In the quiet, she could hear the distant hum of a generator. Somewhere, someone had a machine not meant for this distance, a sound like the breath of an animal in the hills. And she knew his warning was not conjured from superstition. The world beyond the ridge was moving. She imagined drones, reporters, men in suits stamping a site as resource or specimen. She pictured the university's logo on a press release about discovery. And there was a fury in her at the thought of being used as anyone's instrument, as if her career were a blade and the world were eager to catch whatever fell. "We can make a middle way," she said aloud, trying to find a version of truth that did not feel like betrayal. I can bring in your legal folks, speak to the ministry. I can make them listen. I can argue for a protected status. I can—" Tomas shook his head slowly. "You can try." The words were gentle as a rebuke. "You can try, and they will station men at the ridge and write permits and bring chainsaws to the saplings to justify building a road. Elena, the world does not stop because you name it. The world moves where money is easier, and money does not care for words it cannot swallow." Her recorder buzzed in her pocket like a small, accusing heart. She thought of Professor Lasker back in the city, of his beady eyes and the way he had smiled at the thought of a career-making specimen. She thought of the press images that would come. Elena Marquez with a careful hand on an enormous furry shoulder, a camera flash like a sunburst on the forest. She had dreamt of that image, that neat triangle of discovery. Now it felt obscene. "Then what do you ask of me?" Her voice broke. It was less a question than a surrender of the presumption she had carried since she was a child and believed knowledge was always good. Tomas's fingers closed on a blade of grass. He stared at her hands, at the marks on them, and something like pity crossed his face, folded into an unexpected tenderness. "I ask you to hear us," he said. "Not only our speech, but our memory. My family has kept a ledger the world does not know. We have names for things and ways to close doors. There are hollows of safety, places where the forest will hide if the right rites are done. We can move the living creatures to deeper sanctuaries. If you will not photograph them, if you will not take bones, if you will not let their image be turned into commodity." "And in return?" Elena asked. There was a bargaining edge to her voice because she could not help it. She was a scientist who believed in reciprocity. Every offering needed a ledger entry. "What will you give me in return for burying my notes, for not publishing? What will you give me for potentially destroying my career?" Tomas's face folded into an expression she could not read for a long moment. The forest made a small sound like consent, and a branch raked the sky with a soft, nostalgic scratch. "I will teach you to listen," he said finally. "Not to the data that fits in tables, but to the way a forest keeps promises. I will show you the hollow. I will show you the other voices. And if the world comes and takes, I will stand beside you and do what my family has always done. I will hold the story in my bones and refuse to give it up. Not because I am against the city, but because I have seen what happens when they do not remember." Her mind went to the image of him standing, small and stubborn, against men with permits and guns. She imagined him covering her back, and the image was bewildering and hot like a lamp. Tomas had a history she did not. He had a brother. She had seen the photograph pinned crudely inside his jacket, gone years ago after some unspecified betrayal, a loss that Tomas observed like an unfinished sentence. There was pain in Tomas that was not performative. It was the kind of hurt that dug deep wells under the skin of a person and dug in for generations. That memory made him fierce and careful. Elena thought of permissions and possibilities, and of the pressing hunger she felt to share this truth with the world on her terms. But what he offered, listening, teaching, protection, carried the scent of a redemption she had not known she needed. Her life in the city had been a ledger of accomplishments and good intentions. Here, among saplings and the dead giant's fur, the moral weight was visceral. Her throat tightened. She could imagine a future where she stood in the city and read the paper, having chosen empire. That future tasted like ash. It made her feel simultaneously small and monstrous. "I need time," she said. "I need data. If I am to make a choice, it will be because of evidence. Show me the hollows. Show me whatever you have. Let me record what I can in ways that do not break the living. Teach me to listen." Tomas nearly smiled, the movement breaking something in his face and making him look younger, softer. He stood and offered a hand to help her up. "That is all I ask," he said, "that you do not rush us. The city moves like an avalanche. Do not let their teeth be the first thing you feel. Give us nights. Let the forest show itself to you without flash and lens." They began a slow walk back to the ranger's cabin, the dead Omul Paduri a heavy shape behind them. Elena kept glancing over her shoulder as if expecting something to have moved when their backs were turned. She found that Tomas watched her watch the forest in a way that felt like a living presence, sometimes with fondness, sometimes with the vigilance of a man guarding a secret. He talked on the path, telling small things, a grandmother's recipe for a pine root tea that kept mosquitoes away, a story of how he and his brother had once chased a fox until they found a spring where the fox had left its pups for a badger to raise. He told the stories like someone settling a child for sleep, but the tone was different when he spoke of the covenant, a lowered voice, a cadence that suggested taboo. There were lines he would not speak unless they had breached them. Those were the lines that came with old blood. "What was your brother's name?" she asked at one point, because the edge of his sorrow had been a strange companion all morning, and she felt a pull to understand the hollow. It was small, intimate, almost reckless. "Toma," he said without looking up. "He was always younger in my mouth. We were named for the same saint, the same name, and he took lighter risks. He loved the idea of being seen. That is why he left, in the end. He wanted to be in the city." There was a quick flare of anger in Tomas's voice that he tamped down. He was taken once by men who promised him gold for a story. He came back empty-handed and with other things he could not show. His leaving, we have not spoken of it in the way people speak of ordinary loss. Elena remembered the photograph. Tomas's brother in a faded denim jacket, grinning, arms slung over Tomas's shoulders in a younger, sunburnt picture. The idea of Toma going to the city and being undone by it made Elena's insides contract. She thought of herself at 20, promising to let nothing be lost to ignorance, to be vigilant against the corporate appetite. The irony tasted sour. She had once been Toma. She had thought the city a place of salvation. It had not been kind to those who carried something too messy to fit in a grant proposal. They reached the cabin by the time the light had dropped 2 shades. The structure was a low thing of stone and cedar, smoke curling from the chimney like a smoke signal to the past. Inside were artifacts that were not museum pieces, but living things. A varnished yoke, an iron trap about to be mended, jars of preserves, a ledger of names written in a hand that looped like river water. There was a map on the wall with places circled in a way that suggested protection rather than conquest. Elena could feel the cabin's walls holding the scent of coffee and resin, the safe that memory makes of items that mean everything to one family and nothing to another. "Tonight," Toma Wist said, laying out blankets and offering her a cup of astringent tea that was sweetened with blackberry honey, "we listen." They sat by a small stove, the glow of the flame washing their faces orange. Thomas pointed to an older wooden box, and his fingers hovered over the lid as if it might be hot. "This is our ledger," he said, "not a ledger of money, but of names." Every time we have hidden something from the world, we write it down, so we do not forget the bargain. We are the memory for the forest when the rest of the world forgets. Elena felt the weight of the word memory settle into her. She had always believed that science was a kind of memory, data as the bones of truth. Now Thomas's ledger felt different, less about ownership than about care. It spoke of tenderness disguised as duty. She wanted to know what the cost of being the memory was. The cabin walls hinted at costs paid through time. She looked at Thomas. His profile by the fire made him look like one of the wood carvings he kept on the mantel. There was an ache in her that felt like longing, even as she battled the arithmetic of loss and ethics. "Will you let me hear what the animal said?" she asked, perhaps foolishly, as if asking such a thing might bring the creature awake into the room. Thomas's hands stilled on the box. "It said what it said," he said, "but the sound of it matters. It was not merely words in our tongue. It was a chorus of the forest and the animal together, the memory using the animal's mouth. It wanted to make us remember that we had not always been conquerors, that the world had been a teacher as much as a resource." Elena closed her eyes and let the warmth of the stove bring tears to her. She thought of her training, her mentors, her university's lobby with its proud plaques. She imagined the press conference, the applause, the citations. There was pride in that future, but it felt increasingly like a theft. She had always tried to reconcile the scientist and the dreamer in her, to be rigorous and yet reverent. Sitting by Thomas's fire, she felt the possibility of a different reconciliation. To put the city's hunger under a bell jar and watch it fester. To decide about the rightness of exposure not as a default, but as a moral act. How many more are there? How many omolpaduri? Thomas looked away, and the movement made his jaw taut. "No one can count them," he said. "They are not like deer that multiply in visible cycles. They are old things that appear when the forest needs them. Some say they are one being that stands like a slow tide through the wood. Some say they are many. My family believes a few, and that they are chosen by the trees themselves. But numbers are not the point. The point is that they witness, that they speak when the balance breaks. That is why they are dangerous. Men fear witnesses. That is why men came with bullets." Elena placed her cup down with a soft clink. "Do you think someone wanted it to say that sentence, or did your ancestor stories make you expect some kind of moral?" It wasn't a leading question. She genuinely wanted to know if the line might have been bait, a carved phrase forced into speech. Thomas's look was steady. "It could be either," he said, "or neither. The forest does not care for our theories. The forest acts. If someone asked a man to force the animal's voice, then that man is worse than a hunter. But sometimes the forest chooses to speak through a dying throat. Perhaps it wanted to give us one last push. We will learn more in the days to come." He was right. There were days to come, and that simple truth felt like a cliff edge. Elena had to decide how much of herself she would trade for what she loved. She had to weigh fame against fealty, ledger against lullaby, and in the middle of the night, the image of Thomas standing under the stars with his back to the ridge felt like an invocation. There was a budding knowledge between them, an intimacy built of shared grief and the urgent, hungry need to make a choice that would not simply be a transaction. Outside, through the small cabin windows, the forest whispered like a crowd of old listeners. Elena let the sound in and found she was less afraid when she did. She also found that the question of publication no longer felt like a matter to be settled alone. It had become a moral knot tied between two people, one who held the power to name and the other who held the power to remember. In that knot, she felt a heat she could not yet name, a thread of real human connection that might either unravel everything or bind it into something new. They slept later than either meant to. In the dim hours, Elena dreamed of the creature's voice and how it had rolled like wind across the surface of a lake, carrying images of hands digging into soil and children planting saplings. She woke to Tomas watching her, as if he had been awake waiting for her breath to return to a normal rhythm. He wrapped a blanket around both their shoulders with a practiced gentleness and, without saying it, promised that the next day they would not stand alone. Dawn creased the world in pale, trembling light. There was a new resolve in both of them, hers more intellectual and jagged, his steadier and lined with the weight of promise. The push had been made and the pull was beginning. They would move toward the hollow. They would meet the creatures that remembered. And as they prepared to step into a history that was as much about keeping silent as it was about speaking, the forest seemed to lean forward to listen. The first accusation came like frost. By mid-morning, a pickup rattled along the single-track road, the bed piled with unfamiliar equipment. Orange fencing, a battered cooler, a hand-lettered sign that read, "Private Survey." Two men stepped out, one in a neon vest with a clipboard, the other with a camera slung like a weapon. They had the careful gait of people who had rehearsed gratitude in front of mirrors so it would look spontaneous in the face of inconvenience. Behind them trailed a truck stamped with the name of a private firm Elena half remembered from grant boards and footnotes. Terra Veritas Environmental Solutions, an outfit that spun conservation language into contracts and then bent it to client needs. Tomas went still as a willow. His face closed under a sudden hard chalking of lines. "They aren't supposed to be this low," he muttered. He moved without melodrama, but he moved quickly, an owl's silent flight. He intercepted the men with a measured courtesy that Elena had come to recognize as a form of armor. "Good morning," he said. "This is a protected area. You need a permit from the ministry." The man with the clipboard smiled like a man who'd eaten his words the night before and was saving them for later. "We have permits," he said. "Expedited survey, University Commission. We're here to assist Dr. Marcus." Elena's skin pinpricked. The claim had a drip of falseness, like water colored with rust. She had not authorized any survey. She had not signed an expedition. Her name had been a lantern dangled to coax compliance. She felt anger like a current, bright and immediate, in her chest. "Who issued the commission?" she asked, stepping forward in the way only those trained to command rooms do, shoulders back, eyes bright. "Dr. Lasker's office," the man said. "We've been subcontracted. He's very keen to document the Omul Paduri for the university archives." Tomas's jaw moved. Elena tasted bitter ash. Lasker, the man who had smiled at her with predatory praise and promised her a corridor to fame. Lasker, who had written her into grant applications, and who, in the soft glow of the city, had been her champion. The idea that he had bypassed her consent, that he had used her name to get access, without telling her, felt like an old wound opening. "You are not allowed on this land," Tomas said. His voice had the authority of the forest and the authority of a man who had once been ignored and therefore learned the art of being immovable. "We have legal paperwork," the man insisted, producing a packet. Small print blurred into the geography of the page. The paper smelled of new ink and the big city. Elena could see the margin notes in Lasker's hand in her mind like a ghost. Fine specimen, publish quickly, secure donors. She felt suddenly like the last child in a room full of conspirators. "This is fraudulent," she said. "Professor Lasker did not authorize this. You have no right." The man's smile thinned and then went hard. Dr. Marcus, the university is the university. We have obligations. When a specimen is found— A specimen? Tomas's laugh was small and sharp. It was not scornful so much as grieving. It was a sentient being, sir. It spoke before it died. It asked us to remember. You cannot turn that into a specimen without stealing a confession. The man's hands tightened on the clipboard. Elena saw impatience ripple across his face like a storm. We operate by the rules of evidence, he said. We document, we collect. It is how knowledge is preserved. Tomas stepped closer so that his breath fogged in the air between them. You preserve with knives, he said. We remember with vows. There are consequences to both. Your rules have a way of killing everything they touch. Elena felt herself become a hinge between two doors she couldn't open at once. The professional 50 years of institutional clean lines, and the living, messy ethics of a place that had kept its bargains. She wanted to shout at the man that what he called preserving might be an erasure. But she also felt something like panic, that Lasker's name would be enough to bring legal weight, and that the men would not care for her protest any more than for a gust of wind. They'll call in authority, the man said into his radio. We'll have a formal notice. Don't, Elena pleaded. The plea was both personal and professional. She did not want her work co-opted. She did not want the publicity. The idea that her own reputation might be used to justify taking what Tomas guarded felt like a violation. She looked at Tomas. His face was set to limestone. He had that look of someone who had decided what they would die for long before the question arrived. You must understand, he said in a low voice reserved for her alone. I cannot allow this to happen while I can stop it. My family's covenant is older than their permits. We have ways to complicate men who do not understand the forest. Elena thought of legal appeals and of jet-black suits that never learned how to listen. She thought of Lasker's eyes when he had told her to be bold, and she felt the tremor of disappointment. You mean sabotage? She asked. Tomas's mouth was a thin line. I mean interference, he corrected. I mean we delay. We show paperwork that needs more time. We appeal. We slow them until the ministry sees that this is a place more trouble than benefit. But if men come with guns, if they come with chainsaws dressed as evidence, we defend the land. Not just for the Omo Paduri, but for the hollow, for the saplings, for the names in our ledger. Elena's heart hammered a tribal rhythm. The idea of defending the land with anything other than legal measures pulled at a muscle that had learned discipline in university labs. Yet, sitting beside Tomas by the stove at night, she had felt the closeness of the world that had not been quantified. The men who had come in the truck represented everything she feared and everything she had fought to be, the world in which knowledge could be bent into profit. And now they had her name as a key. Don't lie, she said then, bitter and desperate. If Lasker is involved, if the university is trying to claim him, tell me now. If you hide this and later they say Elena Marquez conspired to withhold evidence, you will not be accused if you bring the truth willingly, Tomas said. His hand closed on hers for a moment, more gently than any pledge of property. We will not ask you to lie in public. We ask only that you resist opening the site to them. Help us to keep the secret until we can do what must be done. A camera clicked. The man with the camera had stepped forward to take photographs. Elena's stomach dropped. She wanted to stop across the clearing and snatch the lens. She wanted to grab Lasker by the collar and demand that he answered for what he had set in motion. Instead, she found her hands trembling on the binder she still carried, the binder where she had hoped to keep everything tidy, where she had once sketched an idea of herself as a careful guardian of knowledge. The men produced a copy of an email, an official-looking PDF. Lasker's header had the university crest. "You see," the man said triumphantly, "we have orders to secure the area pending collection." Elena read the email with a nausea that made the world tilt. It was not handwritten, but it bore his initials. He had signed for an expedited collection. The university's appetite was now a paper animal with teeth. Her colleagues would call, her supervisors would press, the presses would salivate. She felt suddenly very small and very exposed. The choice she had considered as an ethical exercise in theory leapt into ruthless reality. If she refused to cooperate, she would be obstructing institutional protocol. If she agreed, she would be betraying an entire living law. Either way, she would be cut and remade. The idea of that remake felt like an amputation. Tomas watched her with a tenderness that was a kind of pain. "You do not have to decide now," he said. "We will slow them. We will ask for time. But we must speed the hollow. We must prepare the places of refuge for any living ones left. And there is something else we must do." "What?" Her voice was a crack. "There is a ledger in my family chest," Tomas said. "Names written in comings and goings. There are secrets in the handwriting, maps, codes. There is a betrayal in the handwriting, too. My brother's name is on one of the pages in a way that does not make sense. He went to the city, yes, he sought a life. But I think he brought something back, or he was used. Either way, if anyone here has a reason to betray us, it would be a man who loved being seen." Inside Elena, the room of theory rearranged itself into a domestic scene. She thought of careers and betrayals. She thought of the city's appetite for fame that had swallowed Tomas's brother. She felt a deep fear that the same thing could happen to her. Not carbon eating, but a moral devouring. To be used to justify destruction and then brandished as a cautionary tale. "You think he's connected to Lasker?" she asked. Tomas nodded slowly. "I think there are men who wish to make a living from our keeping. I think there are men in the city who trade in images and sell them as absolution. I think my brother, loving to be seen, might have looked for a way to be part of that market. Maybe he failed and came back with shame. Maybe he met men who knew how to use shame. We cannot tell yet." The conspiracies stacked like fallen trees. Elena felt the ground beneath her shift into a tangle of motives, loyalties pulled in jagged directions. Her image, her name, her work had become a lever in a machine she did not control. The realization made her dizzy with a vertigo that had nothing to do with altitude. "We must find out," she said. There was a resolution in the line of her jaw that surprised her. It was not the neat, published resolution of a paper. It was a raw, human hunger for truth and justice tangled with guilt. "If your brother is involved, if Lasker conspired, I will not be used. I will not be someone else's blade. We will slow them, we will hide what needs hiding, and we will find Toma and see what he knows." Tomas's hand found hers in the way of a promise. "We will find him together." They moved like conspirators then, two people who had been strangers in professional tides, but were now yoked by compassion and mutual exposure. The first order was to secure the ledger and the hollow. They gathered what small artifacts mattered: a carved whistle, some jars of resin, a map with folds like creases in an old face. Elena thought of sampling the bark for DNA, and then stopped herself. The impulse to take the forest in pieces to understand it felt grotesque. Instead, she wrapped items in cloth and placed them in Tomas's pack, relinquishing the itch to own the story. That night, after the men had left with promises they would return, and the pickup's engine had dwindled to a rumor on the road, Elena lay awake counting the choices she might make and the ways she could be dishonest to herself. She had come here to catalog a lineage and to prove a theory. Instead, she was now an accomplice in a secret. The thought both soothed and terrified her. She had stepped off the map she knew. Every coordinate that followed would be provisional, carved in the dark between what she could publish and what she could protect. There was a fracture forming between loyalty to a discipline and loyalty to a living covenant, and it cut Napoleonic arcs through everything she had been. She cupped her hands against the thin wall of the cabin and felt Tomas breathe on the other side like a subtle tide. Outside, the forest sighed with old languages. Elena understood then that secrets lived in the roots as much as in human minds, that betrayals could be tender as well as brutal, and that the only thing she knew for certain was that nothing would be simple again. The men in neon vests would return, the university would call, and the city would demand spectacle. Between those demands lay a fragile human transaction, a woman who could name things and a man whose family had promised to remember. There would be fractures, lies told in the name of safety, alliances broken, hearts splintered. But there would also be revelations about Tomas's brother, about Lasker's appetite, about the forest's own ways of speaking. Elena closed her eyes and tried to prepare herself for both the wounds and the truths. She had not imagined love as an element in this logistics. She had not expected that loyalty would taste like longing. But the night was long, and the world outside rustled as if rehearsing what would come: confrontation, accusation, and the slow, painful work of truth. They found the hollow before known, a bowl of old earth where the trees arched like cathedral ribs and light came down as if contrite. Tomas led, feet sure on the root-strewn path, Elena close enough to feel the warmth of his coat where their shoulders brushed. The forest here felt watched rather than inhabited. The air had the concentration of a held breath, as if the place had been rehearsing welcome for someone who only came rarely. In the center of the hollow was a ring of young saplings, each carved with a notch, each with a single white stone laid at its roots like a votive. The stones pulsed under the soft dust of leaves, pulsed like an answering heart. "We prepare," Tomas said. His voice was low, reverent. "If the living ones can move, they will hide here. If not, their names are placed so the forest remembers. This hollow holds vows. It will hold them." Elena knelt and set a palm against the earth. It hummed, not with electricity, but with the slow, communal beating of a body that spans centuries. She thought of laboratories and microscopes and the way glass coldly separated viewer from subject. Here there was no glass, only touch, and the possibility of mutual recognition. Her usual instruments, catalog labels, sterile swabs, felt like blunt tools at the edge of a delicate surgery. Outside, the world clicked its teeth. Inside the hollow, time had a different moral geometry. "We need to move anyone who's still alive," Tomas said. "We need to make the shelters ready." He opened his pack and revealed small horn whistles, a coil of thin rope wrapped in cloth, a handful of charcoal marks. He handed her a whistle. "This is not to call them," he said. "It is to promise. Blow it when you need to bind an oath. The sound folds into the wood. It is small, but it means a thing." "So the whistle binds?" Elena asked, surprised by how hungry she felt for a ritual she had once mocked as superstition. She had expected pride at cataloging a lineage. What rose up inside her instead was a protective tenderness, communicated in gestures and implements that had kept a covenant. "It reminds us that promises are louder than permits," Tomas said. He watched her blow the tiny note. The sound was thin at first, and then expanded into the hollow as though watered. Leaves shivered like an audience coughing to attention. Elena felt her face grow honest in the way it seldom did in front of professors with clipboards. They worked with a quiet industry. Tomas and his nearest kin, his cousin Matej, had arrived overnight, cheeks raw from cold and eyes bright with a warrior's zeal, marked off paths, set out damp cloths for beds, arranged bundles of leaves and resin in places where the creatures might sleep without fear of human smell. Elena cataloged nothing she would later publish. Instead, she annotated maps with care instructions, with warnings about water flow and where to lay offerings of acorns and bark. She recorded soundscapes with a device that sealed the recordings away behind a password Thomas would not give to any official, not even to her. It was a private archive. She felt the strange heat of complicity growing in her chest. That afternoon, they found the first living thing. A smaller figure, half obscured under a fern, eyes like deep brown coals and breathing like a bellows. It flinched at the sight of a human hand and then froze, measuring intentions. Thomas moved slowly, the way people approach wolves, not like men who brandish curiosity as a weapon. He knelt and held out a palm. The creature sniffed, then sighed, a sound of both fright and relief. It was not animal in the way Elena's textbooks used the word. There was a cautious, adaptive intelligence in the tilt of its head and the way it matched Thomas's breathing. "You see," Thomas whispered when it allowed him to touch its shoulder, "they are witness and memory both. They do not ask for our dominion. They ask for our remembering." A gunshot rang out from the ridge like an accusation. For a hair of a moment, everything froze. Birds stalled. Even the small breathing of the hidden creature tightened. Elena's stomach dropped. Thomas turned to the sound and his face became a knife. "They're close," he said. "They test. They are not patient." "They'll come with men who have orders," Matei said, voice flat and certain. "They will bring more than paperwork." Night fell like a curtain they pulled together. The men in neon would return, Elena knew. The university had already shown its hunger. But something else happened that night. Allies came, not all of them human. From the dark folds of the forest, small watchers, badgers, foxes, an owl that seemed to take particular interest, arrived and sat just beyond the ring of torchlight. They were not servants, but witnesses, as the Bigfoot had been, and their presence steadied the group. Thomas walked the perimeter and spoke low, calling names in a language Elena had not yet learned, but which felt like a litany of gratitude. She answered as best she could, trying to mouth syllables that bent like branches. The act was foolish and brave in equal measure. It fixed her where she stood. When the first men returned with flashlights and the groan of authority, there was a line drawn in the dark that they did not cross. Elena stood in front of Thomas, the whistle on a cord like an amulet against the rapaciousness she had once considered inevitable. The men in neon vests barked about permits, about collection windows and chain of custody, their language mechanical and greedy. But they hesitated at the ring of saplings because the forest did not permit them to step, and because people who had come with cameras found their lenses fogged and unfocused when they tried to point them at the living creatures. "Back off," Matei said, and his voice held an old authority that was not polite. The leader of the men, newspaper ink under his fingernails and a suit that smelled of city cigarettes, stepped forward, but his boots found the sapling roots and he stumbled, a literalization of the moral clumsiness Tomas had warned about. "Tomas Ionescu," the man said, as if calling a name could unravel an oath. "Step aside. Dr. Marquez has authorized a survey." "Elena?" Tomas asked, turning to her with eyes that searched as if they needed the honesty that had, until now, been partial. The whistle felt cool against her sternum where it hung. Her answer was not the one his voice expected. She could have allowed authority to carry her forward, to salvage the professional facade that she had been building for years. She could have smiled into the phone, mumbled about expediency, and watched the hollow empty into the city's maw. She felt the old pulse of ambition, but it was weakened by the memory of the creature's last sentence, by the weight of a dying throat that had told them to remember. She breathed in and felt the forest in her lungs, The choice curved around something larger than her resume. "Not while I can help stop you," she said aloud. The words fell not from the podium of an academic conference, but from the narrow place where love and guilt meet. It was an admission both professional and personal. The man with the clipboard scoffed, called her name into the radio, and then hesitated as if the sound of her voice had changed the frequency. They argued until the cold bit to the bone. They held paper up, and Tomas countered with stories, with the ledger, with the memory of what happened when paper had proven an insufficient shield. Arguments are a kind of violence. What followed was another form, the negotiation of sacrifice. Elena knew what she could lose. Tomas knew what he might give. They chose a plan that asked for something of each of them, and asked for more of the city than it liked to give. Elena would not be the one to sign the tapes or to put her name on an extraction order. In return, the university would be allowed a sanitized, heavily redacted report that mentioned an anomalous biological specimen without images or locations. It would be a press release with a grain of truth and a bowl of misdirection, and it would placate sponsors and keep chain of custody promises without naming the hollow. She would return to the city with a paper-thin, careful, and ethically convoluted that acknowledged findings without betrayal. The men accepted initially because bureaucracy loves compromise. They were less eager to accept that a woman who had the power to ignite headlines had chosen to deflect them. But there was a cost Tomas paid that she could not measure in citations. He walked into the hollow under a sky like bruised linen and performed a rite the way a man pays a debt in full. He cut his palm with a small flint, not as spectacle, but as covenant. The blood was a red punctuation mark on his skin as he smeared it over the white stones and spoke the ledger's names aloud. Names of creatures, of trees, of an ancestor who had learned to barter with the forest. Elena watched and felt her own throat tighten. It was a sacrament and a surrender. She had promised to keep their secret, but watching him give his blood to the ground felt like a sacrificial currency she had not been asked to purchase. "I do this because I cannot let them take what remembers us," Tomas said to her later, cleaning his hands with moss as if that were the most natural thing in the world. "And because I believe you will keep the story safe." She reached for his hand then, and for a moment their fingers braided with a casual intimacy that felt like a new law. "I will write," she whispered, "but I will write to protect, not to claim. If I must lie to save them, I will take that lie as a burden." "You will not be alone," he said. He kissed the callus on the side of her thumb like a benediction, not a promise of forever, but a pact against the immediate predators. The kiss was small, stubborn, and it anchored her more surely than any credential ever had. Elena felt the world tilt, not away from her ambitions, but toward a new axis where memory mattered more than headlines. They stayed awake half the night planning diversions and legal appeals, contacting an old friend of Elena's in the ministry who owed her a scholarly debt, drafting press statements that were precise enough to satisfy and vague enough to protect. They made a list of safe routes for the creatures, mapped backup hollows, and rehearsed the places where humans might be barred by law or by the sound of a whistle. It was all simultaneously absurd and courageous, two people making scaffolds out of ethics and devotion. When dawn smeared its light across the ridge, the men in neon vests returned, this time flanked by an official in a gray coat whose badge smudged the morning. They found a standoff, a professor who refused to be the spear, a family who had already closed some of its doors, and a scientist who had chosen to keep a secret because she had come to love the thing it protected. The official read the redacted papers, fielded the diplomatic statements, and in the end, after hours that felt like centuries, he left with his hands empty and his face a map of dissatisfaction. The men from Terra Veritas drove away, muttering about delays and budget overruns. They would come back, perhaps, The university would ask questions. The city would not stop its hunger. But for the moment, the hollow breathed easy, and the living things within it moved as if relieved of a weight. Elena and Tomas sat on a fallen log and watched a small figure that resembled both child and beast climb to the sapling ring and lay its forehead against the white stone. It was a quiet moment of repair, a stitch sewed in the dark between two people who had made a choice. "You sacrificed your career," she said suddenly, not with accusation, but with witness. He laughed, a soft, ragged sound. "I have no career to lose in the way you do," he said. "My career was never a ladder, but I sacrifice what I must. We all do." She reached for him and this time did not hesitate. Their hands met in the space between names and obligations, and for a second the forest seemed to release a long-held breath. They had made a dangerous truce with the city, and an intimate covenant with each other. It was not perfect. It would be tested, broken, and mended again. But in that bruise-pale dawn, with witnesses in the woods and secrets tucked under roots, Elena and Tomas claimed something fragile and fierce. A choice to protect memory at the cost of exposure, and a fragile, growing love that would be required to keep that promise. They left the hollow with a brittle peace that smelled of charcoal and pine. The university grumbled and then retreated into protocol. Professor Lasker sent stiff emails that Elena answered with careful omissions until his interest waned into bureaucracy. The men from Terra Veritas found costs higher than their gain and postponed their commission. The official in the gray coat took the easiest path and declared the site under review, which was a kind of mercy. Tomas's ledger stayed closed in its wooden box, the names sealed under flaps of oiled cloth. Elena brought back a single copy of a sound file she had promised to bury, an encrypted memory she refused to publish. There were consequences. Elena's funding board questioned her methods. A department head asked for clarifications she could not give without betraying oaths. She accepted the slow shrinkage of institutional favor as a tax for having kept a secret that wanted to live. She felt the tug of colleagues who did not understand why she had chosen a hollow over a headline. The city still wanted narratives, and she had given it a fragment rather than a feast. But the fragment became a quiet testament in a drawer, and sometimes that felt like enough. Tomas's family met Elena on mornings and evenings, teaching her how to read the husk of a pine cone, how to fold a promise into the leather of a shoe, how to sing a dryness back into a spring. He showed her where his brother's name had been crossed out and then written again in a different hand. They traced the errant strokes until they found a clue that led not to betrayal but to shame. Tomas, the brother, had gone to the city and been swallowed by shame. He had not sold the forest, but had been used and then hidden. They found him weeks later in a low boarding house, eyes red with confession. His return was small and ugly and tender. Apologies, repairs, a family warming the edges of a broken man with slow tasks and guarded forgiveness. He refused to speak to Lasker. He would not meet the men who had promised him light and given him knives. Love settled not as a climax, but as a careful habit. Elena learned the cadence of Tomas's silences and the small rituals that kept his grief from becoming a fault line. He learned to see her as someone who could keep a ledger in her hands and a heart in her pockets. They argued, of course, about the risk of secrecy, about whether silence could ever be purely protective and not a theft of others' right to know. They made mistakes and apologized, and sometimes lay awake tracing the outlines of choices they could not undo. In spring, the forest hummed with a sort of recovery. Saplings thickened. The smaller living ones ventured farther each day, teaching Elena how to move without looking like a threat. In the evenings, she and Tomas walked the ridge and spoke in low voices about the future, about a plan to petition legal protections from within the ministry, about a private archive that would hold the names and sounds safe from prying eyes. They built a life on compromises. Elena would publish a paper that spoke of anomaly without location, a paper that nudged policy without exposing sanctuaries. Tomas would teach her vows and allow her occasional encrypted notes for future generations. The last scene of that season found them at the edge of the hollow, watching a young creature lay its head against the white stone and sleep. Tomas looped his arm through hers. She rested her head against his shoulder. The forest around them breathed, an old, steady inhalation that sounded like forgiveness. In that exhale, Elena heard the dying creature's sentence become not an accusation, but an instruction. Remember. They had kept the memory, honored the covenant, and in doing so had learned how to love across the fault line between note-taking and keeping. The world beyond the trees still wanted to conquer, but here, under a sky full of slow birds, two people chose to remember instead. And that choice, simple and defiant, reshaped the shape of them both.